The roar of diesel engines at 6 in the morning isn't something you forget. I shot up in bed, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Through the bedroom window, I could see Karen Whitfield standing at my fence line in her signature pink blazer, pointing at my grandfather's old shed like she was directing a military operation. The excavator operator had already hooked the corner of the roof. Metal groaned against wood, that sick sound of something being torn apart that was never meant to break. I scrambled into yesterday's jeans and bolted outside, bare feet hitting cold concrete. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" I shouted across the yard. Karen turned, her blonde hair perfectly styled even at dawn, holding a clipboard like a weapon. "Good morning, Dave. We're removing this eyesore per the emergency resolution passed yesterday evening." "What emergency resolution? I was never notified." She smiled that practice smile of hers, the one that never reached her eyes. The one that declared this structure a visual blight on our neighborhood standards, Section 15.7-B. The excavator lurched forward. I could smell the diesel exhaust mixing with the scent of torn pine boards. Inside that shed were 30 years of my grandfather's tools, fishing gear, and memories I couldn't replace. $12,000 in equipment alone, not counting what it meant to me. My hand instinctively went to my pocket, fingers closing around the old brass permit badge my grandfather had kept on his workbench. The metal felt warm, worn smooth by decades of his thumb, rubbing it when he was thinking. It was all I had grabbed in my panic to get outside. "You can't just tear down someone's building without proper notice," I said, my voice cracking like I was 15 again. "Actually, we can." Karen consulted her tablet with theatrical precision. "When a structure poses an immediate threat to property values and neighborhood cohesion, the homeowners association has broad emergency powers." The operator gave me an apologetic shrug before the excavator's arm swung down. The crash of splintering wood echoed off the houses around us. Mrs. Patterson peeked out her kitchen window, shaking her head like I was the problem here. Within 30 minutes, my grandfather's shed was nothing but a pile of broken boards and twisted metal on the concrete pad where it had stood since 1987. The same year I'd helped him pour that foundation, back when I was 12 and thought he'd live forever. Karen tucked her clipboard under her arm and smoothed her blazer. "The cleanup crew will be by this afternoon to remove the debris. There'll be an $8,000 assessment for the demolition, plus disposal fees. You'll receive the invoice by certified mail." $8,000 I didn't have, for destroying something that belonged to me, on my own property. "That this is insane," I muttered, staring at the wreckage. "This is proper neighborhood management," Karen corrected. "Perhaps next time you'll attend the monthly meetings instead of assuming the rules don't apply to you." But here's the thing about Karen Whitfield that nobody talks about at those meetings. She'd been gunning for my family ever since my grandfather had refused to sell her his lake access 20 years ago. This wasn't about neighborhood standards. This was personal. As I stood there in the morning chill, diesel fumes still burning my nostrils, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to roll over and take this. Not from her. Not from anyone. I pulled out my phone and called in sick to work. Then I walked back into the house, grabbed my grandfather's old permit badge from my pocket, and really looked at it for the first time in years. The brass was tarnished, but the engraving was still clear. Permanent structure permit, issued 1987, County Code Enforcement. Funny thing about paperwork, it has a way of outlasting the people who try to ignore it. And Karen Whitfield was about to learn that the hard way. The brass permit badge caught the morning sunlight as I turned it over in my palm, and something clicked into place that I had missed for 38 years. By 9 a.m., I was standing in the lobby of the County Code Enforcement Office, still wearing yesterday's clothes and probably smelling like diesel fumes. The receptionist, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes, glanced up from her computer. "Can I help you?" "I need to speak with someone about a demolition that happened this morning. Someone destroyed my shed without proper permits." She frowned. "Do you have the demolition permit number?" "That's just it. I don't think they had one." 20 minutes later, I was sitting across from Dylan Martinez, a code inspector who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He was maybe 28, with the kind of nervous energy that comes from being new at a job where everyone treats you like the enemy. "So, let me get this straight," Dylan said, flipping through his tablet. "The Homeowners Association ordered a demolition at 6 this morning, and you weren't notified?" Not only wasn't I notified, I was never informed there was even a problem with the structure. Dylan's eyebrows went up. That's not how this works. Even emergency demolitions require 72 hours notice to the property owner. He started typing, his fingers moving fast across the screen. What's your address again? I gave it to him, watching his expression change as he scrolled through whatever database he was checking. That's weird, he muttered. What's weird? There's no demolition permit on file for your address. Not today, not this week, not this month. He looked up at me, confusion written all over his face. Who exactly authorized this demolition? Karen Whitfield. She's the president of our homeowners association. And she told you there was an emergency resolution? Section 15.7-B, she said. Dylan was already shaking his head. Homeowners associations don't have authority to order demolitions. Only the county does. And we sure didn't order this one. The coffee in my stomach turned cold. So what you're telling me is? What I'm telling you is that someone just committed a pretty serious crime on your property. Have you ever had one of those moments where everything you thought you knew suddenly flips upside down? That's what was happening to me right then. This wasn't about neighborhood standards or emergency resolutions. This was about Karen Whitfield thinking she could steamroll over me because I'd never fought back before. Dylan pulled out a clipboard and started writing. I'm going to need you to file a formal complaint, and I'm personally going to drive out there this afternoon to document what happened. What kind of trouble is Karen looking at? Well, unauthorized demolition of a structure on someone else's property? Dylan's pen paused over the paper. That's destruction of property in the first degree, plus whatever your shed and contents were worth. I thought about my grandfather's tools, the vintage fishing reels, the handmade workbench where he'd taught me to use a chisel. Probably $20,000 all told. Jesus, Dylan shook his head. That pushes it into felony territory. But as I was filling out the paperwork, something nagged at me. Karen was a lot of things. Manipulative, power-hungry, vindictive, but she wasn't stupid. She had to know she couldn't just order a demolition without permits. Unless she thought she had permits. Dylan, is there any way someone could fake a demolition order? He looked up from his clipboard. You mean forge county documents? I guess it's possible, but that would be even worse legally. Why? Because Karen seemed awfully confident this morning, like she genuinely believed she had the authority. Dylan was quiet for a moment, then he leaned forward. You know what? Let's take a ride out to your place right now. I want to see this alleged emergency situation for myself. As we walked out to his county truck, I fingered the permit badge in my pocket. 38 years ago, my grandfather had stood in this same office, getting official permission to build that shed. He'd followed every rule, crossed every T, dotted every I. And now someone had destroyed it based on made-up paperwork and fake authority. The diesel smell was still hanging over my yard when we pulled up. The excavator was gone, but the pile of broken lumber remained, looking even worse in the full daylight. Dylan walked around the debris, taking photos with his tablet and making notes. This was a solid structure, he said, examining a broken beam. Well built, good materials. No safety issues I can see. That's when Karen's pink Cadillac pulled into her driveway next door. She climbed out, saw us standing in my yard, and marched over with that same clipboard from this morning. Excuse me, but this is private property, she announced. Dylan held up his county badge. Dylan Martinez, Code Enforcement. I'm investigating an unauthorized demolition. Karen's confident mask slipped for just a second, then snapped back into place. There's nothing unauthorized about it. We followed proper procedures. Ma'am, there's no demolition permit on file with the county, and homeowners associations don't have authority to order demolitions anyway. Of course we do. It's clearly stated in our emergency powers provision. Dylan's voice got very quiet. Can you show me the county authorization for this demolition? Karen fumbled with her clipboard, flipping through pages. I have the resolution right here. Emergency meeting yesterday, unanimous vote. That's not what I asked for. I asked for county authorization. The silence stretched out like a rubber band ready to snap. Karen's face was turning red, but whether from anger or embarrassment, I couldn't tell. The homeowners association has broad authority to maintain neighborhood standards, she said finally. No, ma'am, it doesn't. Not when it comes to demolishing structures. That requires county permits, environmental assessments, utility clearances, and 72 hours notice to the property owner. Dylan turned to me. Mr. Thompson, I'm going to need you to file criminal charges. This is going to be a police matter now. As Karen's face went white, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Power. The police station smelled like burnt coffee and disinfectant, the kind of institutional smell that makes you feel guilty even when you haven't done anything wrong. Officer Patricia Chen sat across from me at a metal desk that had seen better decades, taking my statement about the demolished shed. So, let me make sure I understand this correctly, Officer Chen said, clicking her pen. Mrs. Whitfield claims she had authority from the Homeowners Association to demolish your structure, but there was no county permit? That's right. Dylan Martinez from Code Enforcement confirmed it. No permit, no authority, no legal right to touch my property. Officer Chen made a note. And the value of what was destroyed? $20,000 minimum. The shed itself, plus all my grandfather's tools and equipment inside. That puts this in felony territory. She looked up from her paperwork. Are you sure you want to press charges? Sometimes these neighborhood disputes can be resolved without getting the courts involved. I thought about that morning, watching 30 years of memories get reduced to splinters and scrap metal, about Karen's smug smile as she handed me an $8,000 bill for destroying my own property. I'm sure. All right then, we'll issue a warrant for Mrs. Whitfield's arrest on charges of felony destruction of property. By the time I got home, word had spread through the neighborhood like spilled paint. Mrs. Patterson was waiting by my mailbox with her arms crossed, the same disapproving expression she'd worn when I was 12 and accidentally put a baseball through her window. Dave Thompson, what in heaven's name are you thinking? I'm thinking someone destroyed my property without permission, Mrs. Patterson. But Karen said it was an emergency situation, that the shed was dangerous. The shed was fine, and even if it wasn't, she had no legal authority to tear it down. Mrs. Patterson shook her gray head. You're making a mountain out of a molehill. Can't you just work this out like civilized people? That's when I realized what I was really up against. It wasn't just Karen Whitfield, it was an entire neighborhood that had gotten used to letting her make decisions without questioning them. They saw me as the troublemaker, not her. Mrs. Patterson, would you be okay with someone tearing down your garden shed without asking? Well, that's different. No, it's not. It's exactly the same thing. She huffed and walked away, but not before I heard her mutter, "Some people just can't let sleeping dogs lie." The next morning brought a certified letter from Karen's attorney. I ripped it open at the kitchen table, coffee growing cold as I read the legal jargon. The bottom line was simple. They were suing me for harassment, demanding I drop the criminal charges and pay for frivolous legal proceedings. $12,000 in damages they wanted, on top of the $8,000 for the authorized demolition. $20,000 total for being the victim of a crime. Have you ever felt like the world was playing by rules nobody bothered to explain to you? That's where I was sitting that Thursday morning, staring at legal papers that might as well have been written in ancient Greek. My phone rang. Dylan Martinez from Code Enforcement. Dave, I've got some information you need to hear. Can you come down to the office? An hour later, I was back in that same lobby, but this time Dylan looked excited instead of confused. I did some digging into your shed situation, he said, pulling out a thick folder, and I found something interesting. He spread photocopied documents across his desk, building permits, inspection records, correspondence between my grandfather and the county from 1987. Your grandfather didn't just build that shed, Dylan said. He built it with special county approval as part of a rural access program. See this stamp here? He pointed to a faded mark on one of the permits. That's a historic preservation designation. Your shed was actually listed as a contributing structure to the neighborhood's rural character. I leaned forward. What does that mean? It means tearing it down without proper environmental review wasn't just unauthorized demolition. It was destruction of a historically designated structure. Dylan grinned. That's a federal crime, Dave, and the fines start at $50,000. The brass permit badge in my pocket suddenly felt heavier. There's more, Dylan continued. I pulled the records on all the recent demolitions in your neighborhood. In the last 2 years, Karen Whitfield has ordered 7 different structures torn down using the same fake emergency authority. A gazebo on Maple Street, a workshop on Pine Avenue, 2 garden sheds on Oak Road. She's been doing this to other people. Gets better. Each time, she's had the same excavation company do the work, and guess who owns 20% of that company? I didn't need to guess. Her brother-in-law, Marcus Whitfield. Every fake emergency demolition puts money directly in her family's pocket. The coffee shop across from the courthouse was nearly empty at 2 in the afternoon. I sat at a corner table, staring at the folder Dylan had given me, when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Drop the charges or things get worse for you. Last warning. I showed the text to Dylan, who'd agreed to meet me to go over the evidence. Well, he said, reading it twice, now she's threatening you. That's intimidation of a witness. Want to add that to the charges? But I was thinking about something else. Karen had been doing this for 2 years. 7 other families had lost their sheds, workshops, gazebos. 7 other people had been bullied into paying bills for their own property being destroyed. And none of them had fought back. Dylan, I need the names and addresses of those other victims. Why? Because Karen Whitfield is about to learn what happens when you pick on the wrong person. The brass permit badge felt warm in my pocket as I walked out of that coffee shop. My grandfather had followed every rule, respected every regulation, trusted the system to protect what he'd built. But sometimes the system needs a little help. The first address on Dylan's list belonged to Margaret Santos on Pine Avenue. Her workshop had been demolished 8 months ago, and when I knocked on her door that evening, she answered with the weary expression of someone who'd been beaten down by bureaucracy. If you're here about the Homeowners Association, I already paid the fine, she said through the screen door. Mrs. Santos, I'm Dave Thompson. Karen Whitfield had my shed torn down 3 days ago. I'm filing criminal charges, and I think you might want to know why. Her expression changed. Criminal charges? I spent 20 minutes on her front porch, explaining what Dylan had discovered, how the demolitions were illegal, how Karen had no authority, how her brother-in-law's company was making money off of fake emergencies. But she showed me the violation notice, Margaret said, her voice getting smaller. Code 15.7-B. That code doesn't exist, I checked. Margaret's hands started shaking. I paid them $4,000 for destroying my own workshop. My husband's workshop, really. He built it himself before he died. The anger in her voice cut right through me. This wasn't just about property damage. This was about people being robbed of their memories, their security, their dignity. Mrs. Santos, would you be willing to file a police report? At my age, going to court, dealing with lawyers? She shook her head. I just want to be left alone. I understood, but as I walked back to my truck, I realized I was carrying more than just my own fight now. I was carrying the weight of everyone who'd been too tired, too scared, or too beaten down to stand up to Karen Whitfield. The second address was Tom Bradley on Oak Road. His garden shed had been demolished 6 months ago, but when I explained the situation, his reaction was different. Son of a bitch, he muttered, standing in his driveway where the shed used to be. I knew something wasn't right about that whole thing. Tom was a retired contractor, built like a linebacker going soft around the middle, but still carrying himself like someone who'd never backed down from a fight. She hit me for $6,000 in demolition fees, Tom said, plus another $2,000 for environmental cleanup because I had paint cans in there. Did you keep copies of the paperwork? Every damn page. My wife always said I was too paranoid about keeping records, but he trailed off, staring at the empty concrete pad. She died 2 years ago. Cancer. That shed was where I kept all her gardening tools, her potting supplies. Karen knew that. The way Tom's voice went quiet told me everything I needed to know about how personal this had gotten. I'll file charges, he said. Hell, I'll testify, Sue, whatever it takes. Nobody should have to go through what they put me through. By Friday morning, I had 3 more neighbors willing to come forward. The Santos workshop, Tom Bradley's garden shed, a gazebo belonging to the Johnsons, a storage building that belonged to an elderly man named Frank Chen, and a small barn that had belonged to the Kowalski family. 6 families, over $15,000 in fake fines, and years of intimidation. But when I walked into Dylan's office to update him on what I'd found, his expression stopped me cold. We've got a problem, he said. What kind of problem? The kind where someone with connections makes phone calls to people with more connections. Dylan leaned back in his chair, looking like he'd aged 5 years since Wednesday. I got called into my supervisor's office this morning. Apparently, Mrs. Whitfield's attorney contacted the county attorney's office. The coffee in my stomach turned to acid. And they're saying this whole thing is a civil matter. A dispute between neighbors that should be handled through the homeowners association mediation process. But you said it was a felony, destruction of property, fraud, intimidation. I know what I said, but my supervisor is saying we might have been hasty in our assessment, that maybe there's documentation we haven't seen that would justify the demolitions. Dylan's hands were clenched on his desk. Dave, I've been doing this job for 3 years. I've never seen the county attorney's office take such a sudden interest in a property destruction case. Someone got to them. That's what I'm thinking. And if they're pressuring code enforcement to back off, what do you think they're doing to the police department? As if summoned by our conversation, my phone rang. Officer Chen from the police station. Mr. Thompson, I need you to come in this afternoon. There have been some developments in your case. What kind of developments? The kind we need to discuss in person. Dylan and I looked at each other across his desk. Dave, he said quietly, Karen Whitfield has more friends in this county than we realized, and they're not just social friends. The police station felt different when I walked in that afternoon. Colder, more hostile. Officer Chen led me to the same metal desk as before, but this time there was another man in an expensive suit sitting beside her. Mr. Thompson, this is District Attorney Robert Hayes. He wanted to speak with you about your complaint against Mrs. Whitfield. Hayes looked like every politician I'd ever distrusted, with silver hair and a smile that never moved past his lips. Mr. Thompson, I understand you've had a dispute with your neighbor about some property modifications. Property modifications? She illegally demolished my shed. Well, that's where things get complicated. Hayes opened a briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers. It seems Mrs. Whitfield has documentation showing that your structure was indeed in violation of county codes. He slid the papers across to me, official-looking forms with county letterheads, violation notices, engineering reports declaring my grandfather's shed structurally unsound and dangerous to neighboring properties. Every single document was dated within the last week. These are fake, I said. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Thompson. Are you suggesting county employees falsified official documents? The way he said it made it clear that was exactly what he was daring me to suggest, in public, on the record. Officer Chen looked uncomfortable. The district attorney thinks it might be best if you and Mrs. Whitfield work this out through civil mediation. And if I don't? Hayes leaned forward. Then we'll have to investigate whether you've been filing false police reports, harassment charges, possibly defamation, depending on what you've been saying about Mrs. Whitfield around the neighborhood. I stared at those fake documents, understanding what was happening. Karen didn't just have friends in the county government, she had allies, people who owed her favors, people who could make paperwork appear and disappear. People who could make me disappear if I pushed too hard. I need some time to think about this, I said. Of course. Hayes stood up, smoothing his tie. But don't take too long. Mrs. Whitfield is a pillar of this community, and she's been very patient with your accusations. As I walked out of the police station, my phone buzzed with another text from the unknown number. It's smart choice. Drop everything by Monday, or we start talking about your late grandfather's tax issues. My grandfather had been dead for 15 years. Whatever tax issues they were threatening to manufacture, I'd never be able to prove they were fake. Karen Whitfield wasn't just playing by different rules. She was making up the rules as she went along. That weekend, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the fake county documents, feeling like David facing Goliath without a slingshot. Karen had the district attorney, the county officials, probably half the town council wrapped around her finger. What did I have? A pile of debris where my shed used to be, and a brass permit badge that nobody seemed to care about anymore. Sunday morning, I was nursing my third cup of coffee when Tom Bradley knocked on my door. Behind him stood Margaret Santos, Frank Chen, and 2 other neighbors I'd spoken with during the week. "We've been talking," Tom said without preamble, "and we think you're getting railroaded." Margaret stepped forward, no longer the defeated woman I'd met on her porch. "I called my nephew in the state capitol. He's a paralegal, says what's happening to you isn't legal, even if the county is playing along. The thing is," Frank added, "Karen's been doing this for years because nobody ever fought back hard enough. She picks her targets carefully: widows, elderly folks, people who don't have connections. "But you do have connections," said a voice behind them. I looked past the group to see Dylan Martinez walking up my driveway, but he wasn't in his county uniform. He was wearing jeans and a determined expression. "Dylan, what are you doing here?" "Technically, nothing. I'm off duty. Unofficially." He held up a thick manila folder. "I spent my weekend doing some research that my supervisor would definitely not approve of." We gathered around my kitchen table as Dylan spread out documents that made my heart race. "Here's what I found," he said. "Karen Whitfield's demolition scheme isn't just local. She's been running variations of this con in 3 different counties over the past 5 years. He pointed to a newspaper clipping from 2 counties over. Same pattern. Emergency Homeowners Association is powers, fake violation codes, family construction company getting the contracts. Margaret leaned forward. "How is she getting away with it?" "Because she's smart about picking her battles. She only targets people who are isolated, vulnerable, or new to the area. People who don't know the local political landscape well enough to fight back effectively." Dylan pulled out another set of documents. "But here's where it gets interesting. In Jefferson County, she overplayed her hand 2 years ago, targeted the wrong person. The newspaper article showed a photo of a demolished barn and a headline: County officials under investigation for fraudulent demolition scheme. Judge Patricia Morrison, retired state Supreme Court justice. They tore down her property storage barn using the same fake emergency powers." Dylan grinned. "Except Judge Morrison knew exactly which laws were being broken and which officials were breaking them." Tom whistled low. "What happened?" 3 county officials resigned. The construction company got hit with federal fraud charges, and Karen Whitfield quietly moved her operation to our county. I felt something shift inside me, like tumblers falling into place in a lock. "You're saying she's done this before?" "I'm saying she's a career criminal who's gotten very good at working the system, but she has weaknesses." Dylan pulled out one more document, this one with official federal letterhead. "Judge Morrison's case created a precedent, federal oversight of local demolition fraud, and there's a task force specifically looking for patterns like what Karen's been running." Frank Chen was studying the documents with sharp eyes. "You're talking about federal charges." "I'm talking about Karen Whitfield finally picking on someone who won't roll over." Dylan looked directly at me. "Dave, your grandfather's shed wasn't just historically designated at the county level. It was part of a federal rural preservation program from the 1980s. He handed me a document I'd never seen before, stamped with official seals and signatures that made my hands shake as I read them. Destroying federally protected rural structures isn't just a county crime. It's a federal crime, and the FBI has jurisdiction. The brass permit badge in my pocket suddenly felt like it was burning a hole through my jeans. 38 years my grandfather had kept that badge, and I'd never understood what it really meant. "There's more," Dylan said quietly. "I made some unofficial calls to contacts in other counties. Karen's pattern isn't random. She specifically targets properties with federal designations because the local officials often don't know about the federal protections." "But she knew," Margaret said. "She had to know." "That's what makes it premeditated fraud instead of a simple mistake." My phone rang, interrupting our impromptu war council. Unknown number, but by now I recognized the pattern. "Mr. Thompson, this is Sandra Bell. I work as secretary for the Homeowners Association." I'd seen Sandra at a few meetings, a quiet woman in her 50s who took notes and rarely spoke. "What can I do for you, Sandra?" "Can we meet somewhere private? I have something you need to see." An hour later, Sandra and I sat in a booth at the back of Murphy's Diner, the kind of place where conversations got lost in the clatter of dishes and the hiss of the coffee machine. Sandra kept glancing around like she expected Karen to materialize from behind the pie display. "I've been the association secretary for 6 years," she said, sliding a manila envelope across the table. "I've watched Karen do things that kept me awake at night, but I never had the courage to speak up." Inside the envelope were photocopies of documents that made my blood run cold, meeting minutes from sessions I'd never been notified about, demolition contracts signed months before the supposed emergency violations, email exchanges between Karen and her brother-in-law about target properties and profit margins. "She's been planning these demolitions for months in advance," Sandra whispered. She picks properties, manufactures violations, then schedules the demolitions before the owners even know there's a problem. The last document in the stack was a list of upcoming targets, properties marked for emergency demolition over the next 6 months. My name was at the top, but it wasn't the only one. "Sandra, how many people are on this list?" 12 properties, all of them owned by people she considers problems. Tom Bradley's workshop was supposed to be next month, then Frank Chen's garage, then Margaret Santos's greenhouse. I stared at the list, understanding finally hitting me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't about my shed. This wasn't even about money, though Karen was making plenty of that. This was about control, about driving out anyone who might question her authority or challenge her vision of what the neighborhood should be. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. Sandra's hands were shaking as she reached for her coffee cup. "Because yesterday, Karen asked me to prepare fake meeting minutes for next week, minutes showing that the association voted to demolish your house." The diner suddenly felt too small, too warm, too loud. "My house?" "Emergency structural hazard," she said. "Foundation issues that threaten neighboring properties. Same pattern as always, except this time..." Sandra's voice broke. "This time, she's not just stealing your property. She's trying to steal your home." I looked down at the brass permit badge I'd pulled from my pocket, my grandfather's worn thumbprint still visible on the tarnished metal. Some fights you choose. Other fights choose you. Monday morning, I walked into the FBI field office in the state capitol, carrying Sandra's envelope and Dylan's research folder. The federal building smelled like marble and authority, the kind of place where serious people did serious work. Agent Rebecca Torres was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She listened to my story without interruption, occasionally making notes, but mostly just absorbing every detail. "Mr. Thompson, what you're describing is a pattern we've been tracking across several rural counties," she said when I finished. "Organized fraud targeting federally protected properties." She pulled out a file that was already thick with documents. "Karen Whitfield has been on our radar since the Jefferson County case. We've been waiting for someone with standing to file a complaint." "Standing?" "Someone who's been directly victimized and has the documentation to prove it. Your grandfather's shed was registered under the Rural Heritage Preservation Act of 1987. Destroying it without federal clearance is a felony." Agent Torres opened her laptop and showed me a map dotted with red pins across 3 counties. Each pin represents a fraudulent demolition we've connected to Mrs. Whitfield's operation. 17 properties over 5 years. Your case gives us jurisdiction to move on all of them. The scope of what Karen had been doing hit me like a truck. This wasn't neighborhood politics gone wrong. This was an organized criminal enterprise. "What happens now?" "Now we build a federal case, and that starts with you wearing a wire." Tuesday evening, I sat in my living room with a recording device taped to my chest, waiting for Karen to make her move. According to Sandra, the fake emergency meeting was scheduled for Wednesday morning. If everything went according to Karen's pattern, she'd contact me tonight with demands. The call came at 8:30. "Dave, this is Karen Whitfield. I think it's time we had a conversation." "I'm listening." "You've been making some very serious accusations about the homeowners association. Accusations that could be considered defamatory." I could hear the confidence in her voice, the assumption that I'd already been beaten down by the county officials and fake documents. "I've been telling the truth about what happened to my property." "The truth?" Karen's laugh was sharp. "The truth is that your property has multiple code violations that make it a danger to the entire neighborhood. The truth is that we've been more than patient with you." "What kind of violations?" "Foundation instability, electrical hazards, structural damage that could affect neighboring properties." Her voice took on that official tone I'd heard the morning of the demolition. "The emergency committee met yesterday and voted unanimously to condemn the entire structure." There it was, the threat Sandra had warned me about, recorded on federal equipment. "You're talking about my house, Karen." "I'm talking about a public safety hazard that happens to be your house. But here's the thing, Dave. These problems could be resolved. Code violations can be corrected if the property owner is willing to work with the association." "What do you want?" "Drop the police complaints, stop spreading lies about the shed demolition, pay the outstanding assessments, and maybe we can find a way to work together instead of as adversaries." The brass permit badge was warm in my free hand. And if I don't? Then Wednesday morning, you'll receive official notice that your house is scheduled for emergency demolition. And unlike the shed situation, this time we'll have all the proper documentation. The line went dead. I sat in the silence for a long moment, then called Agent Torres. "We got it," I said. Wednesday morning, I was sitting in my kitchen when the convoy arrived. Not Karen's pink Cadillac and a single excavator this time. This was FBI agents in black SUVs, county sheriff's deputies, and enough law enforcement personnel to handle a small riot. Agent Torres knocked on my door at exactly 7 a.m. "Mr. Thompson, we're executing federal warrants. I need you to stay inside until we're finished." Through my window, I watched agents swarm Karen's house. Dylan Martinez was there too, back in his county uniform, but this time working with the feds instead of against them. Other teams were hitting addresses across the county: the excavation company, the county attorney's office, Sandra's house to collect more evidence. By noon, it was over. Karen Whitfield was arrested on 14 federal charges, including fraud, conspiracy, extortion, and destruction of federal property. Her brother-in-law, Marcus, was charged as a co-conspirator. 3 county officials were taken into custody for corruption and falsifying official documents. The district attorney who'd tried to intimidate me, he resigned before the warrants were served. Tom Bradley was standing in my yard when the last FBI vehicle pulled away, grinning like a man who just won the lottery. "Dave, you magnificent son of a bitch, you actually did it." "We did it," I corrected him, "all of us." But as the afternoon wore on and the neighbors started drifting back to their houses, I realized something had changed that couldn't be unchanged. The fabric of our little community had been torn, and some relationships would never heal. Mrs. Patterson wouldn't meet my eyes when she walked past. The Johnson family had sided with Karen throughout the whole ordeal, and they weren't about to admit they'd been wrong. Half the neighborhood saw me as a hero who'd exposed a criminal. The other half saw me as a troublemaker who destroyed their sense of security. That evening, I sat on my porch with the brass permit badge in my hand, watching the sunset paint the sky red behind the pile of lumber that used to be my grandfather's shed. Agent Torres had told me the federal government would cover the cost of rebuilding, but some things can't just be rebuilt. My phone rang. Sandra Bell. "Dave, I wanted to thank you for giving me the courage to do the right thing. At Sandra, you saved my house. Probably saved the whole neighborhood from years more of Karen's schemes." "Maybe, but I keep thinking about all the people who got hurt before we stopped her. Margaret Santos, the Kowalskis, Frank Chen, people who lost things they'll never get back." I understood what she was getting at. Victory doesn't erase the damage that came before it. The important thing is it's over now. "Is it, though?" Sandra's voice was quiet. "Karen's in jail, but the homeowners association is still there. The same people who let her get away with this for years are still making decisions. What happens when they elect someone new? Someone who's learned to be more careful about covering their tracks?" I didn't have an answer for that, because she was right. I'd won the battle, but the war for the soul of our neighborhood was far from over. 3 months later, I stood in the same spot where my grandfather's shed used to be, watching the construction crew put the finishing touches on its replacement. The new building looked almost identical to the original, built from the same plans my grandfather had filed with the county 38 years ago. But it wasn't the same, and we both knew it. The federal investigation had concluded with Karen Whitfield sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and ordered to pay over $200,000 in restitution to her victims. Her brother-in-law's construction company was dissolved, its assets seized to help cover the damages. The 3 county officials who had helped her were facing their own criminal trials. Justice, they called it. But justice has a funny way of leaving scars on everyone it touches. The new Homeowners Association president was Tom Bradley, elected in a special meeting after Karen's arrest. Margaret Santos had been chosen as secretary, replacing Sandra, who had moved to Florida to live with her daughter after receiving death threats from Karen's remaining supporters. Yes, there were still supporters, people who insisted Karen had been railroaded by federal overreach, that she'd only been trying to maintain neighborhood standards. People who blame me for bringing outside interference into what should have been handled locally. Mrs. Patterson still crossed the street when she saw me coming. The construction foreman, a weathered man named Jake, who'd worked with my grandfather decades ago, knocked on my door that evening. "We're all finished, Mr. Thompson. Want to take a look?" The shed was perfect. Every measurement matched the original plans. The same style of door, the same roof pitch, even the same type of hardware. But when I stepped inside and breathed in the smell of fresh pine and new metal, something was missing. The workbench where my grandfather had taught me to use a chisel, the fishing reels he'd collected over 40 years, the coffee can full of bent nails he'd been meaning to straighten someday, the accumulated weight of a lifetime spent building things with his hands. "It's beautiful work," I told Jake. "Your granddad would be proud," he said, but we both heard the uncertainty in his voice. That night, I sat on my porch with a beer, turning the brass permit badge over in my hands. The metal was still warm from my pocket, still bore the impression of my grandfather's thumb. But it felt different now, heavier, like it carried the weight of all the decisions I'd made, all the relationships I'd sacrificed for the sake of being right. My phone buzzed with a text from Agent Torres. "Saw the news about your shed being finished. Justice served?" I stared at that question for a long time before typing back. Justice is complicated. 3 days later, I got a call I wasn't expecting. Frank Chen, one of the neighbors who had supported my fight against Karen. "Dave, you need to come to the association meeting tonight. There's something you should hear." The community center was packed, more people than I'd seen at a neighborhood meeting in years. Tom Bradley called the meeting to order, but before he could get through the usual business, a man I didn't recognize stood up. "I'd like to address the association about recent events," he said, in the smooth voice of someone accustomed to being listened to. "My name is Robert Mason. I'm a property development consultant, and I represent several investors interested in this neighborhood." Tom frowned. "This isn't really the forum for business presentations." "Actually, it is exactly the forum," Mason continued, "because what I'm proposing could solve many of the problems that led to your recent difficulties." He pulled out a folder, thick with documents. "My clients are prepared to make generous offers for properties in this neighborhood, above market value, cash deals, no inspections, no contingencies." The room started buzzing with whispered conversations. "The truth is," Mason said, raising his voice slightly, "this neighborhood has been through a traumatic experience. Federal investigations, criminal trials, neighbors pitted against neighbors. Some of you might welcome a fresh start somewhere else." I felt my stomach drop as I realized what was happening. Karen was gone, but the forces that had enabled her were already regrouping. Different faces, different methods, same result. People being pushed out of their homes. "Of course," Mason continued, "this offer is only available to willing sellers. We're not interested in forcing anyone to leave, but for those who are ready to move on," he shrugged eloquently. Margaret Santos stood up. "What happens to the properties you buy?" "Development, modern housing that meets current standards. This neighborhood has tremendous potential, but it needs investment to realize that potential." Translation: tear down everything that made this place special and replace it with cookie-cutter houses that maximize profit per square foot. I stood up. The room went quiet. "Mr. Mason, I have a question. Did you know Karen Whitfield?" Mason's smooth expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. "I may have met her at some point. It's a small county." "Because what you're describing sounds a lot like what Karen was trying to accomplish. Drive out the old residents, clear the properties, bring in development." "Mr. Thompson, I understand you've been through a difficult experience, but what I'm offering is completely legitimate. No fraud, no fake emergencies, just fair market transactions." He was right, of course. What he was proposing wasn't illegal. It was just the legal version of what Karen had been doing illegally. Tom Bradley looked around the room. "How many properties are we talking about?" "Initially, 8 to 10. The older homes primarily, properties that would benefit most from redevelopment. 8 to 10 properties, including mine, I was sure." The meeting broke up an hour later, with no decisions made, but I could see Mason had planted seeds. People were tired of conflict, tired of uncertainty, tired of being the neighborhood that had been in the news for all the wrong reasons. A month later, the first for sale sign went up. The Johnson House on Maple Street sold to Mason's development company for 30% above appraised value. 2 weeks after that, the elderly couple on Pine Avenue sold. Then another family on Oak Road. One by one, the neighbors who had lived here for decades were cashing out and moving away. Not because they were being defrauded or intimidated, but because they were being offered more money than they'd ever dreamed their houses were worth. And with each sale, the character of the neighborhood changed a little more. I was sitting on my porch one evening, watching another moving truck load up furniture from a house that had been sold, when Tom Bradley walked over. "Dave, I need to tell you something. Lisa and I got an offer today." I looked at him. Tom, who'd stood with me against Karen. Tom, who'd helped expose her crimes. Tom, who'd been elected to clean up the mess she'd left behind. "You're thinking about selling?" He sat down in the chair next to mine, looking every one of his 68 years. "They're offering $200,000 over market value. $200,000, Dave. I could pay off the mortgage, buy something nice in Florida, and still have money left over for Lisa's medical bills." His wife had been fighting diabetes for years, and the medications weren't getting any cheaper. "I understand," I said, and I did. "The thing is," Tom continued, "once Lisa and I leave, how long do you think Margaret will hold out? Or Frank, or any of the others? Mason doesn't need to intimidate anyone or break any laws. He just needs to be patient and pick us off one at a time." That night, I sat in my grandfather's rebuilt shed, holding the brass permit badge and thinking about legacy. My grandfather had built this place with his hands, followed every rule, trusted the system to protect what he'd created, and the system had failed him. I'd fought the system and won, but victory had come at a cost. Karen was in prison, but the neighborhood she'd tried to control was disappearing anyway. The people who'd stood with me were leaving. The sense of community we'd fought to preserve was dissolving like sugar in rain. The badge caught the light from the single bulb overhead, and I could almost hear my grandfather's voice. "Sometimes winning and losing look more alike than you'd expect." 3 weeks later, I got my own offer from Mason's company, $450,000 for a house I'd inherited mortgage-free, enough to start over anywhere I wanted, leave all this behind, forget the fight had ever happened. I held the envelope for a long time before opening it. Inside was a check and a simple note. "The offer stands for 30 days. After that, market conditions may change." It wasn't a threat exactly, but it wasn't not a threat either. That evening, I walked out to the new shed, brass badge in my hand, and made a decision my grandfather would have understood. Some things are worth more than money. Some fights are worth finishing, even when you're the only one left fighting. The next morning, I tore up the check. 6 months from now, I might be the only original resident left on the street. My house might be surrounded by identical new construction that maximizes profit per square foot. The neighborhood my grandfather helped build might exist only in my memory and in the brass badge I keep in my pocket. But every morning when I wake up in the house he left me, when I walk out to the shed we rebuilt together in spirit, if not in fact, when I run my thumb over the worn metal of that old permit badge, I remember something important. You don't fight because you're guaranteed to win. You fight because some things are worth fighting for, even if you're fighting alone. That's the story they don't tell you about taking on the system. Sometimes you win the battle and lose the war. Sometimes justice looks a lot like defeat. Sometimes doing the right thing costs you everything you were trying to protect. But sometimes, late at night, when the neighborhood is quiet and the new houses cast unfamiliar shadows on familiar streets, you realize that winning was never really the point. The point was refusing to be beaten.